Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, NFL Week 9 edition. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, over the course of a very busy NFL trade deadline, I was actively checking the feeds of Adam Schefter, Ian Rappaport, a lot of the other NFL insiders. I was glad to see you didn't try and move me for a 4th or 5th round compensatory pick, that I was able to stay a member of this franchise in our quest to win the Super Bowl.
We were close. I just couldn't get anybody to take your contract on.
And what can I say? It's a little bit bloated. We know it's incentive-laden, and there are a lot of things there as I go into my twilight years. But eventually you'll find somebody like the Chicago Bears with more than $100 million in salary cap at their discretion to try and take on the contract, and they could potentially cut me loose. So it's something to look forward to maybe this offseason instead.
Something to look forward to. That's funny.
So, all right, we got a lot of ground to cover. Let's not sugarcoat it for our listeners that are out there. Not the most attractive slate of games. We're starting to sound like a broken record in the 2022 NFL season, mired in parity where big names are underperforming and teams that, at least on paper, have gaudy records find themselves as massive double-digit underdogs, a recurring theme for this week's show. But before we get into some of the X's and O's for the actual games themselves, I obviously did want to pick your brain on what we saw unfold with the trade deadline, and right in your neck of the woods, the Miami Dolphins have wasted no time. After spending a first-round pick to acquire a pass rusher in Bradley Chubb, they've signed him to a 5-year extension that can be worth upwards of $111 million. Once you factor in incentives, were you a fan of the Dolphins going after Chubb and bringing him in to fortify their pass rush?
It's a good question. Pressure is on an obvious area of concern for Miami. If you look at defensive snaps where they don't send blitz, they're 29th in pressure rate. And you look at Miami's secondary right now, it's really banged up. Byron Jones still on PUP. Nick Needham tore his Achilles, and then Brandon Jones went on IR with a knee injury after getting banged up in the Pittsburgh game. Miami doesn't feel comfortable blitzing at the rate we've really grown accustomed to recently. So natural pressure, I think, in their mind is imperative. And the one good thing is we've seen Jalen Phillips, right? Like he's taken that next step, 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Melvin Ingram's still serviceable, and Emmanuel Ogbah to this point hasn't performed to expectation. But you throw Bradley Chubb in the mix. I get it. He's 3rd in pass rush win rate right now. Kind of creates a heck of a foursome there with those guys. And then you have Zach Seiler and Christian Watkins on the interior who are playing great. In terms of what Bradley Chubb is with previous levels of performance in the injury history, playing 4 games in 2019 and 7 games in 2021, and the idea that Miami gave up a 1st and a 4th and just broke the bank to pay him, knowing that Tua and Waddle are going to have to get paid at some point, makes things a little bit sloppy. I guess if you're Chris Greer and Mike McDaniel and you believe you have a Super Bowl contender, go for it. So they believe that, and here we are.
I was going to ask, obviously you make some of these deals. We've seen the Rams do it in the past to go all in. But when you talk about Super Bowl contenders, hey, look, we were bullish on the Dolphins coming into the year, but asking this team that potentially will be a 3 seed, well, not even a 3 seed because they're not going to win the division. So you have to fall further into the pack, and a road to get to the Super Bowl that could run through Arrowhead in January and Buffalo seems a little bit of a leap of faith. I know it's big picture talk, but man, it feels like all of a sudden that haul of picks that you had, you've parlayed it into some nice pieces. I just don't feel that they're there yet.
I would agree. Now, they don't feel that way. Internally, it makes sense. What are the games they've lost? Ones that Tua hasn't started.
Yeah,
right.
It's a fair point.
Even without him in the lineup, that offense has managed to be 5th in schedule adjusted efficiency. Now we know it certainly skipped a beat, but in their minds, it's like, hey, if Tua was here for this entire 8-week sample, we might have the best offense in football. And so if we can get pressure from the other side and suddenly get some guys back healthy, I mean, Byron Jones is going to return at some point. That's a pretty interesting foursome, getting pressure off the edge, who you can rotate those guys and keep them fresh. From the perspective of this year, awesome. And it appears that they're all in.
Hey, I'll tell you one thing. After the Dolphins made this trade, the first thing that I wanted to do was look at their upcoming schedule. And the next 3 weeks are relatively favorable. Road favorites this weekend at Chicago. A home game against the Browns before they head into the bye week. They'll play the Houston Texans coming out of that. And that's where things start to get awfully interesting. A 3-game road trip at San Francisco, at the Chargers, at the Bills. Home against the Packers, at New England, home against the Jets. So the playoffs may start a little bit earlier than it does for the rest of the National Football League, and we'll get a very good indication of where Miami is with a ceiling to boot, assuming that every key contributor, especially on the offensive side, is able to stay healthy. The Dolphins, though, weren't the only team, obviously, making moves at the deadline. A team that's clearly in rebuild mode ends up shipping a second-round pick to the Pittsburgh Steelers. They bring in a receiver to help a very young quarterback. I know Bear fans love the deal for Chase Claypool. I kind of tried to temper some of those expectations. They apparently haven't looked at some of his productivity and the touchdowns that have fallen off a cliff since his first year in Pittsburgh. And you always wonder, a franchise that does as good a job as anybody when it comes to developing wide receivers had no problems parting ways with Claypool at the deadline.
I think Claypool gives Chicago a weapon they desperately need, and he fits the offense perfectly with the jump ball ability, and he can win over the middle. Hopefully a new situation has Claypool playing at a level he did his rookie year, because it's been 2 straight seasons of regression, and he's been wide receiver 3 in Pittsburgh, to your point. The way Justin Fields has played the last few games, it's encouraging. And now you're hoping that we get a little better look at what Fields is with a little more help, and you have Mooney and Claypool and Kmet and Khalil Herbert. Those are, I would say, plus-level weapons. But at the end of the day, in the whole grand scheme of this, Chicago passed on George Pickens in the 2022 draft. He's a better receiver than Claypool, and he's under team control for 3.5 more seasons, and we've seen the receiver market explode. Claypool is going to push for a new deal this offseason, and I think they're going to obviously have to pay him because the receiver crop coming out in college isn't great, and the free agent market in terms of wide receivers aren't great. So that's where this becomes a little, hey, you could have gotten a better receiver for less money and more control had you went out and got Pickens or a receiver that you really liked in round 2 this past draft. Now, it's not all negative. I don't mind the Roquan Smith trade. Thought that was probably good for both parties. Chicago is in rebuild mode. Roquan isn't worth what he wants, and he's played actually below an average linebacker level the past 2 seasons. I think for us, because we have some Ravens futures, it's positive, right? Championship or bust, and they're looking to build for this playoff run they're about to make, and they do have the 3rd easiest schedule from here on out for the Ravens, and I think Roquan fits their system a little bit better, and I believe Baltimore will be able to get play out of Roquan Smith that mirrors what he was in 2020, and I understand you gave up a bunch to do it, so that's not great, but the idea of being able to play Patrick Queen less and only make him a blitzer, I think that helps multiple positions there. So I don't know if he was worth the juice there. I think Chicago was very smart in getting him out of town. So I really liked getting rid of Roquan. A slight negative in terms of going and getting Claypool based upon what you could have achieved in the draft.
It just felt like such a weird move because Ryan Poles has been savvy, looked like he was trying to acquire draft capital. And while I'm sure in the back of their mind, and you get Aaron Rodgers' comments that Claypool was widely expected to end up somewhere in that division, maybe to the Green Bay Packers, that the Bears see it as a win. I just like the idea of assessing your roster in the offseason, maybe more so than making a knee-jerk move in this particular point. And I guess the other knock that I have for
they're trying to build chemistry.
Yeah,
I think is what they're selling, right? They wanted to implement him into the system before the offseason.
I get it. I just always wonder about a player whose maturity has been questioned when you have a young locker room, if that's the kind of building block that you want to try and take you to the levels that you haven't achieved offensively. But again, the proof is in the pudding. The time will tell, and we'll see if Chase Claypool, being back in the Midwest after spending his time in college at Notre Dame, will resonate with the Bears fan base. There were a couple other offensive players on the move, one of which in the same division was a trade. The Detroit Lions part ways with TJ Hockenson, the Iowa product. He seems excited to have landed as a member of the Minnesota Vikings in time for the Vikings to use him to fill in for Irv Smith, who they put on IR, expected to miss 8 to 10 weeks. We've seen how tight ends have flourished under Kevin O'Connell offenses. Is TJ Hockenson cut from that same mold?
I think so. And this became a need when Irv Smith Jr. went down, like you mentioned, but it's also a massive upgrade. I mean, Hockenson's a top 10 tight end in this league. He's graded out the 9th best pass catcher since 2020. And when you adjust for schedule this season, Hockenson's value is 8.5% over an average tight end. And you hit it perfectly. If you go back to what we discussed in our preseason preview for Minnesota, we highlighted Irv Smith Jr. could be a potential breakout candidate because we know Wes Phillips loves getting his tight ends involved. And Tyler Higbee credits Wes Phillips for changing his career trajectory when Wes was the tight ends coach for the Rams. So I think we see Minnesota try to get Hawk the ball a little bit more than they did Irv Smith Jr. specific to this week. And it's always fun to kind of bring this back into the gambling discussion. When defensive players depart, there's immediate drop-off typically. When offensive players get traded to a new team, it's not just an immediate impact. And specific to Hockenson, the conversation is there'll be some packages that are built for him this week against Washington. He's obviously not going to know or learn the entire playbook in 3 or 4 days, so they'll design some packages for him. He's not going to necessarily hit the ground running and have, a 60-snap game here.
Yeah, and I think, they were pretty open about sharing that their goal is to get him up to speed for next week's game against Buffalo, more so than trying to implement him, to your point, full-time this week on the road against the Washington Commanders. One other trade offensively for a contender and the Super Bowl frontrunner as it stands right now, Buffalo. They could never find a truly defined role for Zach Moss, a guy that we thought was going to take over, especially in short yardage, and as a touchdown vulture in fantasy. I think I've had him rostered each of the last 3 seasons, this year notwithstanding. He ends up getting a fresh new outlook in Indianapolis as the backup to Jonathan Taylor. In comes Nyheim Hines, a player that you've been very high on, especially as a receiver coming out of the backfield.
Love Nyheim Hines. Everyone knows that. He also brings some special teams value. And I think having a running back like this on the field makes it extremely difficult for defenses to spy Josh Allen. In saying that, it feels really redundant, right? I mean, you spent a 2nd-round pick on James Cook. He's averaging more than 7.2 yards per touch.
Who just showed a flash in a huge play against the Green Bay Packers in his run after the catch ability.
Yeah, you literally gave him a 25% snap share against Green Bay on Sunday night, and he rewarded you with 12.7 yards per touch. And I know sometimes the knack, right, on young running backs is they struggle in protection. Right now, James Cook is graded out the 2nd best pass blocker on the entire Bills roster. So I get it. You're making a Super Bowl push. If we can tinker with the roster and add a guy here or there that we might not necessarily need, but all he needs to do is show up for one game or in one instance and make a big play, we're all in. And so you love that mentality for the Bills, and they're going all in. But I would have liked to see James Cook get a little bit more usage because I think he's that dynamic out of the backfield, and he does the same things that Nyheim Hines does. But, again, Hines does give you a little bit of special teams value returning punts.
Yeah, I mean, hey, look, I get it. All these contenders out there trying to bolster their roster. We saw the Philadelphia Eagles make some moves as the front runner in the NFC. We saw the Kansas City Chiefs add a weapon earlier in Kadarius Toney. We saw the 49ers bring in Christian McCaffrey, and maybe the Bills wanted to feel like they did everything they possibly could to try and bring that elusive Lombardi trophy to Western New York. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Payne, what an attractive game we have on Thursday Night Football to kick off NFL Week 9. It's the Philadelphia Eagles on the road at the Houston Texans. We talked a little bit about this game on Monday for look-ahead lines. You were looking at Philadelphia, a 9-point favorite. That number ballooned as high as 14, and there are still some 14s out in the market. Finally, some resistance here. So we'll call Philadelphia a 13.5-point road favorite. Total up from the open at 42.5, 43, out to 45.5, 46. Sometimes records don't lie, and when you look at Philadelphia, unblemished this year, they've led for an NFL high 309 offensive plays run this season. Clear front runners to win the NFC, at least on the odds board. Meanwhile, the Houston Texans, 60 offensive plays they've run all season with the lead. That's 30th in the NFL. Honestly, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this game. I know it's a homecoming for Jalen Hurts. There's plenty of fantasy implications. Get all of your Eagles into the lineup. If they can run the football, they're going to have a big day today. What do you need to see out of the Houston Texans if this football game is going to be competitive into the second half?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure that's going to be the case. And typically,
all right, moving on we go with the 2-minute handicap.
Yeah, we joked about this before we started recording, but it's not too often you see professional bettors run over men, women, and children to lay double digits on the highway for a short week game at a price that's 4.5 points higher than the look ahead and through a key number. But that is exactly what's transpired here. I don't know if you can keep up, because when you think about the script and the matchups and the game state, when Philadelphia's on offense, you have a top 5 ground game and schedule adjusted efficiency going against a Texans defense that's bottom 5 in yards per rush before first contact and EPA per rush allowed, and they're dead last in schedule adjusted rush efficiency. So even if Philly builds a lead early like they've done routinely, and we've seen them kind of take their foot off the gas late, in this matchup, they can still run for points late when they're not trying to press the score. You also have 2 guys along the defensive line for Houston that are out again, Jonathan Grenard and Malik Collins. So the D-line is probably worse than what the metrics indicate because those guys aren't there. And then
is
you
that
look
possible?
at the Eagles. Yeah, it is possible. And even last week, right, I know, what was it, like 223 yards for Derrick Henry, 190 were after first contact. So, it's just, it wasn't like the most horrific performance. They just couldn't bring the big fella down. The other matchup here is you would expect some potential explosiveness for the pass game for the Eagles when they do drop back. This is the largest mismatch on paper of any Week 9 game we have in a metric called receiver advantage over secondary. So basically, the Eagles are number 1 in open advantage, which means their receivers get open at the highest rate, and the Texans are dead last defensively and allowing opposing receivers to get open. So not a good combination there. Flip it around really quick to the other side of the ball, which is where your question was at. When the Texans are on offense, you got to figure out a way to shorten this game, right? Chew clock, get the ground game going. The big fella Jordan Davis for the Eagles is out, and as much as we love and respect and the pedigree and the production they've had in previous seasons, Fletcher Cox and Javon Hargrave, I would say, are struggling a touch. I mean, Philadelphia is surprisingly, this is the one area where they've been hit a little bit. They're 22nd in schedule adjusted rush efficiency. Problem is, Texans haven't been great running it, and there's evidence that things could get worse because, they're bottom 5 in rush efficiency, but they're actually dead last in yards per rush before first contact. That's a far more predictive metric, and Dameon Pierce has fortunately averaged about a yard per rush over expectation, so he's been the saving grace to what could be an even worse run offense. So I don't know if you're capable of chewing clock here. We'll see. I would assume the game plan for Philly is to remove Pierce by just loading the box a touch more than usual, and knowing Davis Mills has regressed. He's now quarterback 35 in terms of EPA plus completion percentage above expectation. He's going to be without his number 2 receiver, Nico Collins. Brandon Cooks clearly wants out. He's slandering the organization on Twitter over the last 48 hours, and now there's talks of a buyout there. So let's see what transpires. Cooks is being labeled as questionable, but if you're the Texans organization and you have any ounce of self-respect, I don't know how you can trot him out there after some of those tweets.
Yeah, I'm not running to put him out there in this particular spot. You kind of take your lumps in some capacity, and while you mentioned Dameon Pierce, we saw last week the Tennessee Titans did an excellent job taking him out of the mix. 15 carries for 35 yards, his lowest average rush per carry, and for a guy that's not getting much help from his offensive line that you mentioned there, over the course of a full 17-game regular season, you're going to get worn down. Your tackle breaking ability won't be the same. and I can't see him putting forth the kind of effort the Houston Texans are going to need to turn this into a one-possession game, at least deep in the contest. So a lot of things to factor in, and I think the point you brought up about Philadelphia being able to shorten the game late running the football reminds me a lot of Alabama, why you couldn't always bet against Alabama even when they played with a big lead, because they were able to rip off huge gains on the ground, and the Eagles, we know, have an extremely deep stable of running backs. All right, on to Sunday, where, hey, looky here, we get to start with another double-digit spread with two teams that both have winning records in the AFC East. Now, this number has come down a touch from where it was previously. The Buffalo Bills, a 12.5-point road favorite for their trip to MetLife Stadium to take on the New York Jets. Total in this game sits at 47. There are some 46.5s dotted across the landscape. Number opened a shade higher. Second largest spread, Payne, of a road favorite against the team with a winning record since 1990. The Bills have 13 wins by 14-plus points since the start of last season. No other team has more than 9. When you look at Josh Allen, 39, 24, and 2 against the spread in his career. Third best ATS record by a quarterback since the merger with a minimum of 50 starts. These two teams, though, they've been juggernauts to the under, surprisingly enough. They've combined to go 11-4 under the total this season. The Bills, however, absolutely dismantled the Jets not once but twice a season ago, winning both meetings by 17-plus points. When you look at the Bills' offense, clearly they were not happy in the wake of a 10-point victory against the Green Bay Packers. Josh Allen pointed the finger at himself, saying they were sloppy in the second half. That can't leave you feeling warm and tingly if you're a Jets fan, but I think from a football X's and O's standpoint, this is one of the more fascinating matchups of the weekend to watch. The Bills' offense, knowing how electric they are against a Jets defense that wants to be talked about being an elite unit, then you know what? Go out there and prove it to me come Sunday afternoon.
That performance in the second half left someone on this podcast warm and tingly, I'll tell you that.
I loved it. I didn't watch a single damn play of that second half and loved checking the score, let me tell you.
There was only about an 8-minute stretch there for the second quarter where that got a little loose. It was certainly the right play there. Okay. Games like this, right, it's an interesting conversation when you have the best team power ratings-wise by all parties, right? Bettors that are respected, bookmakers, even the analytics community all think Buffalo's the best team in the league right now. So you would expect these inflated prices, and the one thing I said last week was, hey, made the game 10.4. It landed 10. One group didn't think the Jets should be catching 13 at home. I know who they are. They're pretty well respected. It's why we're now down to like 12, 12.5. But for that to cash, one thing in this matchup needs to be true, and one thing in this matchup cannot happen. And when I look at this, the one thing that needs to be true is the Jets defense has to be as good as their metrics suggest. We know what Joe Douglas did this offseason. He spent money bringing in Jordan Whitehead and DJ Reed to bolster the secondary, and then he went out and drafted Sauce Gardner, who has been fantastic. Brought in a scheme fit with Quan Alexander on the cheap during camp, and then he got Carl Lawson back from an Achilles injury. Quinnen Williams is playing at a ridiculous level right now. He's number 1 in pressures among interior linemen in 2.5 seconds or less. So he's starting to play towards the draft status. The Jets as a whole right now, 8th in schedule-adjusted defensive efficiency. If you look across the board, they're equally good against the run and the pass, 8th as well there. Jets are hitting quarterbacks, right, and making them uncomfortable, which is something you want to do without having to blitz. Jets are 3rd in quarterback hits per dropback. They blitz at the 3rd lowest rate. So it's just a great combination there. You mentioned Josh Allen's performance. He's coming off what I think is his worst game of the season. And the last time these two teams faced, Robert Slaw did a really good job, and he didn't have as many chess pieces. Held Josh Allen to a 60 QBR. The only reason I'm hesitant that the defense might not be as good as we think is you just take a gander here at who the Jets have played and when they've played them. Ravens have the number 2 offense in schedule-adjusted efficiency, lost by double digits at home. Played number 6 Cleveland, gave up 30. Played number 5 Miami, but a huge asterisk there playing against a 3rd-string quarterback in Skylar Thompson. You look at the last 5 weeks, it's a Pittsburgh offense that's 25th and without a quarterback. Again, 3rd-stringer Skylar Thompson, a Packers offense that's in shambles. Denver, who's 27th. New England, 24th with a quarterback that seems to have lost his confidence. So this is a massive step up in class here. Now, quickly to the one thing that can't happen, and that's Zach Wilson. Can't turn it over. right? Can't lose this game for you. Can't allow Zach to play hero ball. And whether it's Mike LaFleur or Robert Salah, there needs to be this come to Jesus moment, because they have to figure out how to get Zach Wilson to play within the confines of the offense. This isn't BYU where you can like hold on to it and run around and throw off the back foot and play backyard ball. When you look at Zach Wilson playing within structure, or quarterbacks in totality, right? Like 2.7 seconds is roughly the average time quarterbacks release a ball post snap. Zach Wilson's dead last in the NFL at 3.3 seconds. And his entire game and efficiency changes when he holds on to the ball. So if you look at Zach Wilson, when he holds on to it for 3 or more seconds, he's quarterback 40 out of 40 in EPA per dropback, passing success rate, and yards per pass attempt. But when Zach Wilson gets rid of it in less than 3 seconds, he's above average in all 3 of those metrics. And when you have a Buffalo defense that's 9th in pressure rate, hero ball is not going to work here. It leads to turnovers. It's going to lead to a lopsided game. Wilson is completing 19% of his passes when pressured for 3 yards an attempt and has a 1-to-5 touchdown to interception ratio. So Zach Wilson has to be smarter. Those are the 2 ways the Jets stay within this number. If their defense is real and Zach Wilson plays with an IQ above 3. Those are the 2 ways.
When you look at Zach Wilson, the passer rating and all of the metrics that you just outlined there don't lie. I mean, a 7.1 passer rating when pressured this season, the worst in the NFL. But when not pressured, he's actually been a slightly above average quarterback. We know dealing with pressure is a fundamental issue for any quarterback in the National Football League, regardless of the fortress a team builds around you. How much of his struggles this year do you feel can be attributed to the fact that the Jets haven't had their pieces without Elijah Vera-Tucker, no Mekhi Becton, or is it something bigger that Mike LaFleur has to work through? And we saw with the Jets, they got the dreaded vote of confidence from Joe Douglas about Zach Wilson being their guy, the same things they said about Elijah Moore this week and how important he is to this Jets receiving corps.
Mekhi Becton's unfortunate, but we knew at his size and with his injury history that could be a thing that translated at the NFL level, and it has been. But he's been on a milk carton for 3 seasons now. We've lived life without Mekhi Becton. Elijah Vera-Tucker was lost prior to last week. So it's a 1-game sample without him. And that's, I think, the one part that many people don't think about, right? Pressure isn't just an offensive line metric. It's a quarterback metric. And so when you're holding it on to the ball for 3.3 seconds, highest in the league, you're going to get pressured more. And you would think it's a very easy conversation. We're like, look, Zach, your left tackle, Dwayne Brown's 37 years old. He's battling a shoulder injury. He's a shell of himself. You don't have your right tackle anymore. And the other 2 guards on this roster are average to below average. Do you think we might be able to play within the confines of the offense because these are your numbers? How about we do that, bud? Right? It's like the conversation in Moneyball with Dave Justice, right? You want to stay in the league a little bit longer. I want to squeeze the last good ball out of you. How about we do that? And that's the conversation. Even if it's condescending, like play within the confines of the offense or we're going to have to move on. But he did get the vote of confidence from Joe Douglas. Joe Douglas drafted him. He's got to do that. And Elijah Moore, we know what that guy is. Like, get him out there. So design some things for him, right? This goes hand in hand. The guy wants the ball. He's a playmaker in space with the ball in his hands. How about we run some wide receiver screens for him? How about we set up some quick passes for him? Because that fixes both the problems. It makes him happy. It gets our playmakers the ball in space, and it gets the ball out of Zach Wilson's hands.
Do something to be able to make it happen. One last question I had for you on the Bills defense. Tre'Davious White, we expect to see him out there in a full capacity, or do you think the Bills bring him along slowly?
I don't know. Let's see what that looks like. The entire process has been bringing him out slowly, right? I mean, I think he probably could have played a week or 2 ago. They know what this season's about. They want him 100%. I will say this in regards to the total. That's partly why we've dipped down here. And these are scary as hell. But I agree with that initial move under 48. Now, it doesn't mean go ram and jam at 46.5 because 47 is quite a key number in the NFL. But we didn't bet it. Our model did show value to the under. I believe we were at 45.8, but I just don't trust Zach Wilson to not make mistakes and skew some things here. And so ultimately that's why we stayed off. But a group that I respect agreed with our number, and they went under 48 here, and that's now where we're trending towards 46.5.
What could be better than Zach Wilson in known passing situations in a negative game state trying to go under a total in the mid-40s against this Buffalo offense? All right, on to the nation's capital where...
You either have huevos, my friend, or you don't.
Yeah, that's a very fair assessment. Maybe look at the second half. If the Bills are up 24-zip at the break, see if you can get something, and the Jets say, the hell with it. We're just going to run the football and get out of Dodge in one piece. The Washington Commanders will welcome in the Minnesota Vikings, the Kirk Cousins homecoming of sorts. It's Minnesota, a 3.5-point road favorite, painted across the board, total at 43.5. The Vikings come into the game on a 5-game winning streak, Washington on a 3-game run of their own. What's incredible about that combined 8-game win streak for the two franchises, all of their wins have been decided by one score. Both teams ranked top 5 in one-score wins this season. Meanwhile, the Vikings, they have been the monster of positive regression. The Vikings are 5-0 in one-score games after going 6-8 in that particular role last week. Meanwhile, Washington seeking a winning record through 9 games for the first time since 2018. The problem for the Commanders, and maybe it helps them channel what's going on the field, everything you read about the franchise, any Google search, it's all about the off-field nonsense. Payne, when you look at this Minnesota Vikings team, I guess the easiest question to ask, are they as good as their record indicates, and are you optimistic about what Kevin O'Connell has meant to injecting a little bit of life into a team that clearly didn't want to play for Coach Zimmer in the latter stages of last season?
You presented it as an easy question, so I'll give you easy answers.
Yeah,
no,
that's all I'm looking for here.
And yes.
Okay, perfect. Moving on. Let's go. X's.
One of the more interesting games for me with obviously Cousins' return to Washington, as you mentioned, and based on the matchup, it's probably a game that comes down to how Cousins handles pressure, how Kirk operates on third down against the looks Washington gives. So this is going to very much, in my mind, be a Kirk Cousins game. Right off the bat, Minnesota's been wildly efficient running the ball. Top 5 in schedule-adjusted rush efficiency. 45% of the Vikings' runs have gained 5 or more yards. It's second best in the league. You have this nice little Cook-Madison duo that's been pretty dynamic. But the Commanders right now, elite stopping the run, especially the way they're trending. From a basic standpoint, Washington's second in schedule-adjusted rush efficiency, but they're second in yards allowed before first contact. And specific to this matchup, you mentioned Kevin O'Connell and what he's done. Not just, I think, as a voice of reason that guys like in the locker room, but what he's done to change the offense. That's a guy who is a McVay understudy. So he lives in 11 personnel, 3 wide receiver sets. The Commanders are the 6th best in defending early down runs from 11. And so if Washington can stop those early down runs, it bodes well. And, for their defense, because Cousins is going to be faced with more third down situations. And the Commanders are also 6th best defending passes from 3 wide receiver sets on third down. So if you can stop the run early and you can stop the pass on third down, it sets up well here. There's also a pressure advantage for the Commanders. Washington is second best in our pressure metrics. Other data sites have them top 5. On the season, Cousins have been pressured on 34% of his dropbacks. The last 2 games, things have trended even worse. The Cardinals pressured Cousins on 43% of his dropbacks, and then pre-bye, the Dolphins pressured Cousins on more than 42% of his dropbacks. And if you just go back to the top of this conversation with Bradley Chubb, the Dolphins weren't a team that were getting organic pressure. They would have to send blitzes. And right now, Cousins 5 turnover-worthy plays under pressure. The adjusted accuracy dips 24% when pressured versus being kept clean. In terms of that adjusted accuracy, he's QB 28 when pressured. And you have to go all the way back, Todd, to week 2 against the Eagles, where the Vikings offense played a defense that's better than 22nd in pressure rate. So a little bit of a surge to the system here, I would think. On the other side, just quickly here, defensively for Minnesota, or you can lead us there if you want, or you can interject, whatever you want to do. I know we were going to be a little bit quicker with this game.
Yeah, I can let you start things off, and if there's any questions I have as logical follow-ups, I'll definitely interject.
Okay, so defensively for Minnesota, I think there's noise in their numbers, right? They're 21st in schedule-adjusted efficiency, so it's like, they're not great to begin with, but they're being credited for facing a top 10 schedule of offenses. But the Eagles data point, I think, distorts things when you only have 7 samples. And the Miami matchup really skews the metrics because it credits the Vikings for playing a top 5 offense when really it played Skylar Thompson and Teddy Two Gloves and not Tua. Minnesota also played the Saints offense without Kamara, Mike Thomas, and Jarvis Landry. So I think their defense is far worse than the metrics would indicate. Washington's going to be stepping down in class here. They've played a top 10 schedule of defenses. Now you get, again, number 21 Minnesota. And the one thing when you play Minnesota, you know what you're getting, right? You can really scheme specific things because they mostly live in the same look. It's nothing but 2 high shell with zone coverage, okay? The Vikings play 2 high shell at the second highest rate. They play zone at the second highest rate. Now, I know over a small 2-sample start this season, Taylor Heineke hasn't been as good against zone compared to man, but if you go back to last season's sample, which is far more elongated, there's more data points there, there's really no difference in Heineke versus man versus zone, right? Like they're pretty much the same. I know the efficiency numbers haven't been great, but I do think the Commanders have a chance against the Vikings light boxes to have some success on the ground. Delvin Tomlinson, the Vikings' big run stuffer, left the Cardinals game with a calf injury, only played 28 snaps, hasn't practiced yet this week. I do think Cam Dantzler and Zadarius Smith play, but both are dealing with some nagging injuries there. The other area where Washington should find success is in the red zone. And I know the goal is to have as many green and red zone trips as you can have, but you don't need as many when you're converting those trips for 7 instead of 3. Vikings are dead last in the NFL on more than 30% of snaps in the red zone to result in touchdowns. And, you know, when I kind of look at this game, and I'll put it in the context, and again, Todd, you can fill some space in here. The 2 guys on this show who have futures on the Vikings over 8.5 wins and to make the playoffs believe that Minnesota is one of the more overvalued teams right now relative to actual win percentage and fourth quarter win expectancy. I believe this game closes lower than current market.
It's 100%. I mean, you look at the way, and we lived through the Vikings season last year, and I feel like all the bounces we didn't get, having similar positions on Minnesota going into last year, things are breaking the right way for them this year. And to your point, when you dig into a lot of the numbers that we've seen for this team, they don't have the ability to truly run away and hide. They haven't exactly been the most dynamic on the road, and thanks to some scheduling, basically good fortune, this will only be their 3rd true road game of the entire season. I know the game against New Orleans, yes, technically a road game, but not in hostile territory when you go across the pond to London. And it's only their 2nd road game since that Monday Night Football game back in week 2 against Philadelphia. So anytime you also get a team that's used to playing in a controlled environment, going out and playing on what will probably be a much sloppier track just by nature of the stadium and the surface that we see in Washington, it's always a little bit of a different element. Kirk Cousins now has said some things about going back to Washington. He sees it as home. Still on some level, you have to think that Washington defensively can, as you alluded to, will be a jolt to the system for what he's had to navigate through. And I think Minnesota, eventually water will meet its level. Maybe it comes over the next 2 weeks or maybe the next 3 weeks where the Vikings travel to Washington, to Buffalo, and have a home game against Dallas before they play against the New England Patriots on Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I could see that. Now, again, this will be a Kirk Cousins game. It's in the 1 p.m. time slot. It's in a spot he's familiar and comfortable with. That is typically when he tends to play his best ball. A little added motivation and focus this week for sure. But I just think the price here is...
It's rich.
It's rich. And certainly I think the Commanders, and you kind of referenced this at the top, right? There's a lot of noise going around the organization. To me, that's good noise. These players don't like that owner.
Oh,
get him 100%. The hell out of here, right? And Chase, and who returned to the building this week? I don't think he plays, but when you're a defense that's trending in the right direction and you're having success on the field and your horse and Chase Young is back now at practice and you see him, this is a galvanizing thing, right? He's going to come back. We're 4-4. We can get above 500 and then we get Chase Young back. So I think some of those things are actually a positive this week for Washington.
Yeah. Young, pretty quick this week when he was interviewed by some of the Washington Commanders journalists, said, no, he's not targeting a return this week. Now, we've seen that before and how things change, but I would be stunned if he was out there in any capacity. They know it's a long-term prospect, and suddenly for a Washington team that can put together a winning record through 9 games in a muddled mess that is the NFC, they're very much in the thick of things for wild card consideration. Reminder to all of you, our loyal listeners, like we told you at the top of the show, you can follow Payne on on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod and sign up and subscribe to the Bet the Board newsletter. It's a friendly reminder about all the great things we're doing around these parts, not just your college football and your NFL show. We'll have a championship preview for the final race of the NASCAR season on Sunday, and Payne, along with Jesse Craig, doing outstanding work talking about sports cards and collectibles, a great alternative investment asset class for a lot of you folks that may have some discretionary income looking to diversify the portfolio. There's no better way to learn about this space than from two folks that live it day in, day out. Into the afternoon slate, and a game, Payne, I'm sure that all of us had circled when the schedule came out, that has lost a little bit of luster, to say the least. It's a battle of defending Super Bowl champions Sunday afternoon from Raymond James Stadium, and right now we're seeing Tampa a 3-point home favorite in this matchup, total at 42.5. We can call it the Underachiever Bowl. Top two in odds to win the NFC before the season started. Now the Bucs would have to win out if they're going to go over their preseason expectation of 11.5 wins. Battle of the two worst rushing offenses in the National Football League, and the Bucs the dubious distinction of becoming the sixth team since 1970 to be favored in their first 9 games of a season, but have a losing record. And you look at what the Bucs have coming up, they're going to continue to be favorites, win or lose, unless Tom Brady gets hurt. Nothing is going to change in the betting market. When you look at the Bucs, they are one of 3 teams who've been a favorite in every game this season entering week 9. The other 2 teams we've already talked about during the show, the Eagles and Bills, they have a combined record of 13-1. So many things negative swirling around both of these organizations, knowing that the heights they've reached over each of the last 2 seasons. When you look at the Rams this season on offense, how much of their struggles get attributed to just the offensive line, or is it something fundamentally that runs deeper? Why they haven't been able to run the football, why they haven't been able to push the ball downfield, and can the Rams fix any of that against a familiar foe in a Todd Bowles-led defense that Sean McVay has had a tremendous amount of success against in recent meetings?
This is what we talked about at the top, or at least you hinted at it, in that you can start to realize how wonky this NFL season has been when you start to pick out games to talk about on the podcast that you would think have the most intrigue. And Buffalo Jets, right? 2 teams vying for a division crown going against each other, but there's a double-digit spread. A game that we'll get to here in a matter of moments with the Titans and the Chiefs. A double-digit spread despite both being 5-2. And then what we thought would be the contenders in the NFC is really the only reason we're talking about this game, because we wouldn't traditionally talk about a game where one team's 3-5 and the other's 3-4. So it just depicts how wonky this season is.
It's also because we only have 2 games in the late time window, and I didn't want to talk about the Seattle Seahawks again this week.
So what game plan are we going to get from Sean McVay here? He's typically dialed up great ones against Todd Bowles, to your point. He's won that matchup of the minds the last 4 meetings. But the Rams have been really dreadful on early downs. They're dead last in the NFL in EPA. But it is clear that the passing game has worked a little bit better on early downs this season. The Rams have a 27% success rate on early down runs, more than a 50% success rate on early down passes. The delta is massive. So what are we going to get from Sean McVay? And we saw last week out of the bye was a Rams offense that passed more. 69% pass on early downs the first 3 quarters. That was 11% more than any other week. It was double the rate of the prior 2 games pre-bye. But I do ask myself, was this McVay realizing what he has to do moving forward? Or was this McVay thinking about what he had to do in a 1-game setting, saying, we can't run on the 49ers because they're number 1 defensive rush efficiency, and our running backs are an absolute disaster with Henderson being sick and Cam Akers out and Kyron Williams not ready yet? Or is this something that we should expect moving forward because it's actually smart? That's where a lot of variance comes in this game, because I don't know the answer to that. And what's the status of Cooper Kupp? All signs point to him playing, but he's not going to be 100%. And we know this offense and him as a receiver is very much a timing-based offense. If he can't hit his spots or he can't break out of his routes like he usually does, what's the impact there? The Buccaneers secondary looks like it'll get a touch healthier. Antoine Winfield still isn't practicing, hasn't cleared the concussion protocol. Shaq Barrett is obviously out for the season with a torn Achilles, but Carlton Davis and Sean Murphy-Bunting all returned. Akeem Hicks was back at practice. My vibe there is that he'll need a little bit more time, but let's see. So you do at least get Carlton Davis and Sean Murphy-Bunting back there. I just have a hard time, Todd, when thinking about this logically. The Rams are underachieving, right? They have 2 weeks to fix things, prepare a unique game plan, change some things up against a familiar opponent, get healthy, right? You finally figured out how to protect Stafford, who was only pressured on 6 of 37 dropbacks against the 49ers. And the 49ers defense wasn't 100%, and they had been gashed the prior 2 games, and somehow you get blown out. And that, to me, is a little scary. And you just look, right? The Rams are dead last in offensive EPA per play. And they're dead last defensively in pressure rate. It is a terrible combination. So I come back to something I said Monday, and it's really been the same sentiment I've had for multiple weeks now when you proposed the question of who can get their shit fixed quicker. It's easier for me to excuse the Buccaneers a little bit more not being able to fix things when it's this 3-day short turnaround game when your entire secondary is missing than I am, a team that had 2 weeks to figure it out. So that's where this becomes a little bit difficult for me to assess. The Buccaneers obviously have a little bit of revenge. The Buccaneers, I think, can smartly pass more on early downs, and if they do that, it could unlock the offense a little bit. Really, the problem Tampa's having, if you look at it metrically, they're being faced with far too many third downs. And this will shock some people because it's a Tom Brady-led offense, but they're literally the worst 3rd and 7+ offense by percentage the league has seen for a number of years. It is horrific what they're doing on 3rd and 7+. But how do you fix that? Well, you don't put yourself in as many 3rd and 7+s because you don't run the ball every single early down or every single second and long. It'd be a miracle if you could get that figured out. And your hope is that Tom Brady is savvy enough and has enough respect to go to Byron Leftwich and be like, hey, can we change this up a little bit? But so far, that hasn't been the case. There is a positive here is Nick Levert started at left guard in place of the rookie Luke Gadecki. He played fantastic. Gave up 1 pressure against Baltimore, had the best run blocking grade on the entire Bucs roster there. You see Rachaad White being implemented a little bit more. Cam Brate returned to practice this week. So there are some positive things here. You had the coach call out the entire team. There weren't a lot of changes, but that was kind of the wake-up call. And everything's still in front of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers here when you look at their division, when you look at the landscape of the NFC. But what I am hearing on this game, Todd, is there's a little bit of a battle. Forward-facing guys with some relative influence took 3, but the 2 times this game was below the key, guys with real influence behind the scenes have just kind of quietly leaked it back to 3 2 different times.
That's the craziest part about it when you look at the path to success, and we know what the records indicate, but one team plays in a division where there is clearly a front runner, and I'm not talking about the Seattle Seahawks, but more the San Francisco 49ers that are buttoned up. You highlighted the Rams. They came out with a good game plan, at least for the first half, and were unable to make any adjustments, built a 14-10 lead, and did absolutely nothing after the break last week. Meanwhile, here's Tampa, despite being 3-5 in the season. It's not like they're going to have to win 13 games to have a chance to win the NFC South this season. So everything that they want to accomplish clearly in front of them still. Every journey, as cliche as it sounds, starts with a first step. And if Tampa's able to get a win here, erase some of those demons from the Rams, they can build that momentum, start to go forward. But until we see it on full display from an offense that hasn't been able to run the football whatsoever, it should be an interesting game for all the wrong reasons, given what we anticipated this matchup should have been on paper when the schedules came out and we looked at some of the marquee matchups for Week 9.
Now, this is a little hot takey, a little narrative-y. We don't do this.
You don't do these
I absolutely hate it, but I'm going to reverse roles here and propose a question to you. And obviously, and this isn't a jab, you've been in far more relationships than I have, which means you've ended them more than I have. With the Tom Brady saga over with, right? The divorce is official. Is it like out of sight, out of mind now? Does that help?
I don't think it's out of sight, out of mind. I think some level
the public
of closure,
though is out though, right? Like it's done in the headlines.
I think some level of closure helps, but you clearly could tell when you saw Tom Brady's body language, you look at him physically, he just looked gaunt and sickly compared to a guy that professes the TB12 diet, that clearly there are a lot of things weighing on him. And look, for a guy that's been as compartmentalized throughout the course of his career, maybe he's able to put all of that stuff in a locker, bury it somewhere deep in the recesses of his mind and play football going forward. I'm not sure it's as simple as flipping a switch, but I do think on some level that knowing all the sacrifices that Tom has made, knowing that his personal life to a certain extent is in shambles and he's got to put those pieces back together, going out there and performing at the levels that we've seen from the Bucs, at least through the first 8 games, he needs something as a building block. But it almost looks right now, when you watch him out there and the Tampa Bay offense in general, that they're working on hope instead of working through adversity. They want one good thing to happen. And I think the analogy that you mentioned in the game that they lost against the Carolina Panthers when we did the Monday recap show was perfect. Like a jump shooter, they need that first bucket to go in. And once that happens, things are going to start to snowball in a positive manner. So if Tampa can come out, have a good game script on the opening drive, and put some things together, success begets success. And I think that's what the Bucs are looking for at this point in the season.
I like it.
So we'll see if all of that materializes. Obviously great in theory, but it is fascinating to watch that battle that you kind of indicated both on the screen and behind the scenes, figuring out where this number will close right around a key number. Last but not least, Sunday Night Football, a pair of teams with winning records, a pair of teams with very different expectations for the season. And this isn't meant as a knock on the Tennessee Titans, but this team continues to defy the odds every single season, or so it appears. Kansas City, a 12.5-point home favorite at Arrowhead, fresh off of a bye under the bright lights. Total in this game at 46.5. The Tennessee Titans come into this contest fresh off of a win against the division rival in the Houston Texans. They were obviously able to minimize the damage or the exposure they had for Malik Willis because it was a Derrick Henry game early. It was a Derrick Henry game often. But at the same time, this is a little bit of uncharted territory for the Kansas City Chiefs. The last meeting they had against the Tennessee Titans came last year during Week 7, a game that Tennessee Titans took their lunch money, winning 27-3, the largest loss of Patrick Mahomes' career at 24 points. The Titans outscored the Chiefs 27-0 in the first half. They held the football for 36-plus minutes. More impressively, in that game, the Titans only blitzed Patrick Mahomes once on his 43 dropbacks. Mahomes finished with a shade more than 200 yards, was sacked 4 times, and provided the third worst passer rating for a game in his career at 62.3. Now,
Jesus criminy, be a little more positive.
Well, I have to go with the sweet comes the sour, with the negative comes the positive. And here comes the Kansas City Chiefs defense that has somehow solidified their run D, at least to this point in the season. Payne, when I look at Kansas City on the defensive side first, and we'll get to the other side of the ball, do they have the pieces in place to minimize Derrick Henry's effectiveness and make either Malik Willis or Ryan Tannehill win this football game with their mobility and some second-tier receiving options capable of putting a Chiefs secondary that's underachieved on skates?
So I'm going to be a little bit more concise and condensed than you would like here. But you hinted at the top there of some of the success that the Titans have had against the Chiefs relative to everyone else. And Vrabel and the Titans are just one of the few organizations that have really given, this Reid Mahomes era run for its money. But I look at this and I think timing's everything. And it just doesn't feel like a great spot for Tennessee. And I know a lot of Titans fans get upset, and we get some emails and some messages when we talk about not being as good as record or not being as good as perception.
You know what? Hold on one second. For any Titans fan that gets pissed off, and I've done weekly radio in Nashville for I think more than 10 years now. If you want to measure what you've accomplished during the regular season, that's great. Mike Vrabel has done it, but there's a reason that this team has not done what we've expected them or what they've expected them to do in the postseason. Okay, go ahead, continue.
I mean, listen, they find ways to win. They're buttoned up. They stick to their organizational philosophies, but we do this from an objective standpoint. And what we've said for years, and specifically earlier in this season when we've broken down some of these Titans games, is depicted in this line. I mean, you got 2-5-2 teams. 2 teams that have a common opponent in the Colts with opposing outcomes. And yet here we sit with the Chiefs minus 12.5. And you look at the Titans, they've played one team this season that we have power rated above an average team. lost by 34 points and screamed mercy the final 18 minutes, and the Bills nicely obliged. Okay? And so when you look at this specific to the Chiefs offense, right, they're always good. But I think, Reed and Mahomes seem to come up with some wrinkles with extended time off. I'm surprised you didn't mention that. I thought you were going to go right to the bye situation, but it is a little bit overplayed. But
yeah, hold on a second. I'll do that now since you gave me a segue. So I'll lay out the numbers. Andy Reid, 20-3 straight up and 15-7-1 against the spread off a bye in his career. Best straight up record and third best ATS record by any head coach off a bye week since 1970. However, from an ATS standpoint, there's not much meat on the bone. They're only 5-4 ATS since Reed's taken over as head coach of the Chiefs. So I don't want people to predicate their decision-making based on that.
Yeah, and really, the Chiefs' offense is routinely good. And all weeks, with all type of preparation. So it isn't the massive delta that it's been pitched to be. But Kansas City, again, no Tyreek Hill, find themselves number one in the NFL in schedule-adjusted efficiency. They've also played a fringe top 5 schedule of defenses. Kansas City scoring touchdowns on 38% of their drives. It's best in the league. NFL average 21%. The Titans have faced the very easiest schedule of offenses. So there is just this monster step up in class here. You look at the Titans' best defender as well when you start thinking about some scheme things. Jeffrey Simmons, love the guy. An absolute monster. Having a massive season in a contract year. He's second in the NFL creating interior pressure in 2.5 seconds or less. But he's dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury. And the Chiefs have the best interior offensive line in football. So I don't know how much success he's going to have, and I think that's a guy that's really vital to the Titans defense when you think about some of the injuries they've endured on that side of the ball. But, the matchup last season that you referenced in the success that the Titans had defensively came with a ton of too high shell. That was before the Chiefs figured it out. And that's one thing that we've talked about over the years, whether it was the entry point of Patrick Mahomes in this league, and he was seeing nothing but tight man coverage, they figured out how to beat it. And then there was this transition to too high shell where the Chiefs struggled mightily early in the season, of which this Titans game was in that early season sample. They figured out how to beat it. And so now you're seeing defenses go back to man, something that we've talked about probably a month ago. And I know it's something we specifically discussed in the 49ers Chiefs preview a couple weeks back. But the Titans use man coverage at one of the league's lowest rates, a shade more than a quarter of the time. I just don't know if they have the style of defense that translates to giving the Chiefs trouble anymore, especially with that added time. So I think this might be an instance where the bye week can come into play. But Patrick Mahomes, from about the midway point last season through the start of this year, has been one of the most efficient quarterbacks against these too high shell looks. The other side of the ball is why this line is double digits, partly why, right? I mean, Ryan Tannehill is dealing with a high ankle sprain. The data suggests from Deepak that this is roughly a 4-week injury when it's at the severity level of Tannehill's. Sunday night's going to be 14 days. And if you listen to Tannehill in his Wednesday presser, he said, the pain is going to be there. That's where we're at with it. It's just a matter if I can do my job or not. And I think the sentiment is Tannehill is going to play if he can protect himself. The problem here is the Chiefs are top 10 in virtually every defensive pressure metric, and the Titans' offensive line, the inverse. So if Kansas City builds a lead and the Titans are forced to pass to catch up, Tannehill's potentially a sitting duck back there. And you have Spags, who's very creative with some of his blitz concepts with 2 weeks to prepare. And you also see the Titans' game plan last week with Malik Willis under center, right? Chiefs are going to sell out to stop the run. Again, I know Derrick Henry was fantastic. Most of it was him and not the offensive line. 190 of the 228 rushing yards came after first contact. But I think that's the Chiefs' defensive approach no matter who's under center, right? If it's Tannehill, from the onset, we want to make him a passer, force him to push off that ankle to throw. If it's Willis, we want a quarterback that's not developed as a passer yet, right, to beat us with his arm. I think it's about making the Titans do something they're not comfortable with. And if you look over this 5-game win streak for the Titans, they've only trailed for 36 total snaps. So the game script has been extremely positive for a team that wants to run it. And I don't know if that's the case here Sunday night. Now, the line has seen some buyback once it reached 13. There is a math-based group that just thinks this is far too high. What I believe is going to happen is if Tannehill's announced in, this is likely going to settle at 10.5 with a less than 100% version of Ryan Tannehill. If it's Malik, we're going to see this push to 14 and potentially blow through that key.
I can't believe you've blasted the Tennessee Titans and their offensive line and protection schemes, knowing that they've allowed more than a 40% pressure rate so far this season. The question I have for you based on scheme, what has Kansas City done this year that's allowed them to solidify their ability to stop the run, something that's plagued them over the last couple of seasons?
It's a good question because it's certainly not trending that way. Started off like a house on fire where they were able to stop the run, and then we saw Josh Jacobs and the Raiders gash them a little bit. And they've been not as good when you look at some of the trending metrics, and so that's going to be the key here. But specific to this game, you're going to sell out to stop the run because Ryan Tannehill isn't 100% and Malik Willis isn't capable of consistently beating you with his arm. And if he does consistently beat you with his arm in a one-game sample size, you tip your cap and you say mazel. But I just don't think that's going to be the approach here. Now, Kansas City, I think defensively, what they did was they got much faster. They got much younger. And you see the things they're doing with their linebackers, but you can still push them around in the trenches. I don't love the interior lineman situation next to Chris Jones, and I think that's a spot that this defense needs to fix a little bit before they go and make this run, because ultimately they're going to be facing teams that try to exploit that weakness in the middle. So I think they need to figure out how and go get a cheap run-stuffing big body. Those aren't overly expensive right now. There's some veteran guys that are free agents that would be willing to take a pay cut and take half a season off for a chance at a Super Bowl run. So I think that's an area where you might see Veach add another body.
Hey, it makes sense. I mean, we know when you look at Kansas City, they don't pride themselves on winning regular season games. They don't pride themselves on winning division titles in the NFC West that they've dominated. It's all about trying to bring Patrick Mahomes' second Lombardi trophy back to Arrowhead. Should be a interesting game Sunday night, but obviously a big point spread with merit and reason when you're looking at the Kansas City Chiefs taking on the Tennessee Titans. All right, my friend, we've broken down 5 games, including all of the impactful trades that we saw on a very busy deadline day earlier this week, as extensively, as eloquently as we know how to do around these particular parts. We do, however, have one final thing we have to get to, and that's identifying the most actionable element in the form of a best bet.
A game that we broke down, so I won't beleaguer the point. Rotation number 458, the Washington Commanders, plus 3.5. The game is time-stamped above. I think we spent 8 or 10 minutes on it. Go back and listen to that. But the short and skinny would be that we think Washington is able to move the ball a little bit better on the ground. We think Minnesota's defense is a paper tiger, especially when you look metrically and when some of the teams that they've played had some injury issues there. I also think you're just looking at a very overvalued Vikings team right now. I think there's some nice things the Commanders can do defensively in stopping the run from 11 personnel on early downs and stopping the pass from 11 personnel on third downs, which is basically what the Vikings live in offensively under Kevin O'Connell. Again, it'll be the Washington Commanders plus 3.5, rotation 458, but we did break this game down far more deeper atop the podcast, and again, it'll be time-stamped.
You know, you're confusing a lot of our listeners with your paradigm shift in behavior as it pertains to NFL best bets over the last couple weeks. You do realize that, right?
I don't know what you're talking about.
We're going sides. It's back-to-back weeks for sides. We've avoided the totals market. People are getting thrown for a loop around these parts.
Totals have been a little interesting, and it's maybe a conversation for the end of the season, but the market's been a little wonky, and there's been some things that have transpired metrically that I don't really want to get into quite yet and divulge at this point.
Nor should we. No magician should ever reveal all the tricks to his trade.
But there's some things going on, and I mean, there's one we like, but we haven't bet yet, and there's some possible weather there, so I don't really want to give that out till there's a little bit more of a clearer view of the weather situation. So back to the sides.
We'll do what we can to try and get people to the window and keep stacking best bets. And as a game that we broke down earlier, starting to see a total move across the board right now as well. For those folks who have an odd screen, they'll know exactly what time we were recording this fine podcast on a Thursday morning. Again, want to remind all of you, our loyal listeners, you can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Sign up and subscribe to the Bet the Board newsletter. It is the single easiest thing you can do for additional information to help get you to the window each and every week throughout the course of the NFL season. Best of luck with all of your Week 9 investments, and with a Washington Commanders ticket in hand come Sunday afternoon, hopefully we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.